Good day. Over the course of the weekend, following the announcement that the Russians had captured the town of Bakhmut, which has been so bitterly and intensely fought over for many weeks and months now, the Western media, as I said, particularly the media in Britain, essentially retreated into denials. There were some stumbling admissions that Bakhmut might indeed have been captured by the Russians, but generally a refusal to acknowledge this reality. And of course, in that, the Western media continues to take its tune from information provided by Ukraine. The Ukrainian General Staff has not confirmed the fall of Bakhmut, and the local theatre commander, General Syrski, who is the commander of the ground forces, he's apparently or allegedly toured the area on Sunday, toured the battlefronts, and he's issued some kind of defiant statement saying that the Ukrainians are taking Bakhmut into a semicircle, that they can still control certain industrial and residential facilities on its western fringes, its western outskirts. He implies that the battle is still underway, and he still conveys the impression that Ukraine is gaining the upper hand. I have to say, none of this corresponds at all with the situation as it is being described to me by those who are on the ground. Firstly, I now have seen lots of films and pictures of Russian soldiers, Wagner organization soldiers, walking around Bakhmut. They look fully in control of the town. There doesn't seem to be any sign that they are under any kind of pressure or threat. I don't see here in these pictures any sound of fighting. I do wonder exactly where all this fighting on the outskirts is supposed to be happening, because there's no sign of it as far as I can see in these pictures, and all the commentary, all the information that I'm hearing suggests that this fighting in every part of Bakhmut has come to an end. And of course, Prigozhin himself has made further statements to the effect that Wagner is indeed in control of every millimeter of Bakhmut. Now, saying that, it's quite likely that there are still a few Ukrainian soldiers hiding in various parts of Bakhmut, and the Russians will need to carry out a thorough sweep to track them all down. And there's also some problems with mines. The town has been extensively mined, but these are the kind of things that have to happen after a place has been captured. They don't change the reality of who exercises overall control. And as for the Ukrainian advances on the flanks, which we've been hearing so much about over the last few weeks, as far as I can see, they've ground entirely to a stop. And it's been pointed out by a number of commentators who have more experience on military matters than I do, that these advances on the flanks have now become unsustainable and indeed have lost their purpose, given that Bakhmut itself has now fallen. The fact that Bakhmut has fallen, in effect, straightens the front lines. It means that, in practical terms, there are no flanks. There's rather a straight line, which is the front line, and that to the extent that anybody has been taken in a semicircle, it is the Ukrainians who still continue to hold some positions west of Bakhmut, like the important town or village of Ivanivska, where they're still apparently entrenched. So unless something changes radically over the next few hours and days, which I think is extremely unlikely, but then of course I'm not on the ground, but anyway, I still think it is extremely unlikely. I can't help but think that all these comments by Syrski, by other Ukrainian defense officials, comments that have been appearing in the media in the West, are basically attempts to manage a story whose outcome has turned out to be radically different from the one that the Western public had been led to think. I say that because most of the commentary that I've read in Western newspapers over the last 2 weeks or so has been of Ukrainian advances, of the Ukrainian offensive in the area, shifting the momentum of the battle, capturing kilometers of territory, lots of square kilometers of territory, north and south of Bakhmut, of the Ukrainians successfully resisting Russian advances in Bakhmut, of the Russians essentially being on the brink of losing the battle. So, given that this is what the Western public has been led to think for about 2 weeks, given that this is what the Ukrainian public has been led to think for a couple of weeks, it's perhaps unsurprising that it's proving very difficult to just suddenly announce that the battle actually has been lost and that the Russians have won and that Bakhmut has fallen and that the offensives on the flanks have ground to a stop. Now, I should say that before I did this video, there were some reports that the Russians themselves are actually on the attack. There were some reports, which, as I said, I consider very unreliable, that Khromovo, this village to the northwest of Bakhmut, which sits astride the main road, has been captured by Russian forces. I haven't seen any confirmation of this anywhere. But there are reports which do appear to be reliable that there is now an evacuation underway in Chasov Yar. And Russian officials like Marochko are saying that in reality, far from digging in to try to launch a counterattack to recapture Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces in the area of Bakhmut are actually gradually withdrawing and are being redeployed to other areas where they're now sorely needed, places like Kupiansk and such places, and presumably they will also be given something of a rest. By the way, on the topic of soldiers being given a rest, Prigozhin says that the Wagner forces, once they've withdrawn from Bakhmut, which he previously said would be on the 25th of May, that he anticipates they will be given a rest of around 25 days, and he seems to expect that they'll be back in action by the end of June, which I have to say is a lot earlier than that I had anticipated. I've now, by the way, been given another figure for the total number of forces that the Wagner organization, I stress the Wagner organization, deployed in and around Bakhmut. It comes from Ukraine, and it is 26,000. The Pentagon earlier said that there were 6,000 Wagner troops in Bakhmut itself. I think the 26,000 number is probably the more correct one if one includes other Wagner forces located in and around Bakhmut itself. But it is now, I think, acknowledged even by Prigozhin himself that even in the fighting within Bakhmut, some assistance was provided to the Wagner forces by paratroopers from Russia's 106th Airborne Guards Division and by naval infantry, by Marines, in other words. And I'm going to make a guess that those tanks, those Russian tanks, which we saw operating inside Bakhmut and which were shelling some of these big apartment buildings, and which proved very important in the capture of those buildings. Some of these tanks, which would look to be T-90M tanks, that they were actually being operated by tankers from the naval infantry, who, unlike the paratroopers, do actually operate tanks. So that gives us some idea of the nature of the Russian forces. I'm going to say, however, that it still remains the case that to all appearances, a smaller force, the Russian force, in capturing Bakhmut, has defeated and caused immense damage to a much bigger Ukrainian one. Now, Simplicius the Thinker has produced an almost interminable list of the Ukrainian military units that were deployed to Bakhmut at various points in the Battle of Bakhmut. Simplicius the Thinker's pieces are behind a paywall. He writes a Substack blog. By the way, it's a good blog, and if you want to get an interesting idea of the conflict, well, I would certainly suggest that you consider subscribing to it. But if you want to see this list of all these Ukrainian military formations, which, as I said, is enormously long, which Simplicius the Thinker identified, well, you can also go to Larry Johnson's blog, Sonar 21. He has them all there too. And it seems extraordinary. It's an extraordinarily long list. And Larry Johnson makes the point that we are talking about tens upon tens of thousands of troops deployed at various times to defend Bakhmut by Ukraine. If one assumes that all of these forces were up to strength, or at least partially up to strength. And I do recall earlier in the Battle of Bakhmut, all kinds of maps were appearing showing the Ukrainian deployments near Bakhmut. And at one point, I remember that Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama counted 27 brigade-level formations, Ukrainian brigade-level formations, simultaneously operating in and around Bakhmut. And I believe that number eventually rose, or shortly after rose to 35. And enormous proportion of the Ukrainian army was concentrated in and around Bakhmut. Now, just to get a sense of proportion, to get an idea of what a huge commitment this Ukraine made to trying to defend Bakhmut, the Bakhmut fortress, as it was sometimes referred to, well, 27 brigades is more than double the 12 brigades that NATO and Ukraine have allegedly trained up and equipped in preparation for Ukraine's great counteroffensive in Zaporozhye region, about which we have been hearing so much about recently. Of course, if the number did indeed rise to 35, then that's 3 times the number of brigades that have been the number that is being committed to this offensive. Obviously, these 12 brigades that have been prepared for this offensive are up to strength, and the formations that were fighting in and around Bakhmut presumably mostly were not. So we're not talking about exact numbers of troops here, but it does give you nonetheless an idea of the extent of Ukraine's commitment to defending Bakhmut. And I've received some rather plaintive emails. There was one from a viewer who passed on a comment, a public comment made by somebody, a person with family connections to Ukraine, about the fact that more and more people in Ukraine are apparently becoming increasingly worried about what's happened to their loved ones, their members of their families who are fighting in the army. There's increasingly little news about many of them. Payments apparently have stopped in some cases. There's very little definite news about what has happened and happened to these men. And given, as I said, this intense commitment to defending Bakhmut, one has to wonder whether many of these men are dead or wounded in the fighting there. Now, there's been lots of discussion about how many Ukrainian soldiers were killed in Bakhmut. I've seen some extraordinary figures. I'm not going to go there and try to talk about those. I mean, all of these figures are based on rumours and suggestions, and I don't want to add to those rumours. What I will say, however, is that Ukrainian society